The frost clawed at the inside of the Chinley trading post window, like it was trying to get in sharp and white against the glass. Naomi Yazzie stood still as stone near the stove, her fingers wrapped around the wooden handle of a saw. Her late husband, Luke's saw. The heat from the fire barely touched her. The warmth of the wood in her palm, still holding the last of his touch, was fading fast. $1, said the trader Morrison, reaching for the coin box without waiting for her to agree. Naomi hesitated. Her hand wouldn't move. The saw weighed heavier than it should, like it knew it didn't belong on the counter. Luke had bought it their first winter together after the ceremony, when they'd built their hogan by hand, just the two of them, and a pile of lumber they couldn't afford. She remembered the sound of him testing the blade with his thumb, the quiet pride in his eyes when it cut true. Now it sat between her and Morrison like any other tool stripped of meaning. She forced her fingers open. The saw clacked down onto the counter, and Naomi felt something in her ribs clench, twist, and then settle into a dull ache. "These two," she said, sliding over a set of planes. Her voice came out flat, detached. Morrison counted out the coins, dropping them into her palm like they burned him. One by one, cold and insufficient. Behind her, the stove crackled. She could feel someone watching. A man. A stranger. His boots had tracked in dust from the trail, and his coat still carried the fine white crust of the road. He stood silent, hat pushed back, eyes on her, not in pity, but something like curiosity. Naomi didn't look at him. Didn't have the strength to carry both her shame and his gaze. There was no room for shame in survival. Her mother had said that once, but her mother had never stood in a store like this, selling the only things left of a man she loved, just to buy cornmeal and kerosene. A gust of wind howled outside, pushing hard against the door, like it wanted to come in and finish what grief had started. Morrison cleared his throat. Chisels, Naomi reached into the canvas sack at her feet and unwrapped the cloth. She laid them out in a neat line. Luke had always kept them sharp enough to shave with. He used to test them on curls of pine, smiling when the wood peeled away like silk. $1.50 for the set. She nodded. Words felt too expensive to spend. The final tools came out one by one, the brace and bits that bored the holes for their door hinges. The marking gauge Luke had carved from oak and burned his initials into. Each tool left her hand like a piece of bone being taken from her. Only one remained. Her hand trembled as she pulled it out. The level. Cherry wood. Smooth as river stone, balanced just right. Luke's initials were still carved into the side LY, just deep enough to last. She set it on the counter but didn't let go. Couldn't. Morrison leaned in. Handmade. Cherry. I'll give you $2 for it. The fire behind her cracked again. The man still hadn't moved. Naomi stared at the level. The glass vial was still intact, the bubble resting dead center. True. Just like Luke used to say, a level never lies. This one, she whispered, was special. A hand reached past her own and stopped her before she could slide it across. I'll buy all of it, said a quiet, low voice beside her. Naomi turned, startled. It was the man from near the stove. Mid-40s, maybe sun-lined skin, wind-reddened cheeks, and a calmness in his eyes that didn't quite match the dust on his boots. $20, he said to Morrison. For the lot. Morrison blinked. That's more than I know what it is. Naomi felt dizzy. $20. A month's rent. A winter's worth of oil. Her breath caught in her throat. Why, she asked, her voice hoarse. Why would you do that? The man removed his hat and held it respectfully in front of him. Name's Clint Redmond. I own a ranch west of Siley. Need a barn built before winter sinks her teeth in. My foreman broke his leg last week. Got the timber, Got the crew. What I don't have is someone who knows how to do things right. Someone who understands real work. Naomi stared at him. I'm not a carpenter, no ma'am, Clint said. But you lived with one. Luke Yazzy's barns don't fall. Everybody around here knows that. Hearing Luke's name in a stranger's mouth hurt more than she expected. I need someone who knows how Luke worked, Clint continued. Someone who can supervise, keep the work honest. $2 a day, just tell my men what he would have done. That's all I'm asking. A woman in the corner had stopped browsing fabric. A farmer nearby had set down his axe. The air in the store tightened around Naomi. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Winter's coming, Clint said gently. This isn't charity. It's a job. Honest wages for honest work. Naomi looked down at the level between them. The initials burned dark in the cherry wood. The cold coins from Morrison sat heavy in her hand. Not enough. Not nearly enough. She thought of the landlord's last warning, the way the wind came through the chinks in her door, the sack of cornmeal nearly empty, no family, no children, only the memory of a man who made things straight. I wouldn't even know where to begin, she said. Clint's voice was firm. Start by showing my men what these tools are for. The bubble in the level stayed perfectly centered. Naomi swallowed. When tomorrow? I'll send a wagon before sunrise. He counted out the money and gathered the tools with care, sliding them back into the canvas sack. When he handed it to her, it felt different in her arms. Not lighter, just full again. Thank you, Mrs. Yazzie, he said, settling his hat back on his head. Naomi watched him walk out into the wind, her heart pounding like hooves on dry ground. She didn't know if she'd just saved herself or signed up to drown in the memory of the man she'd lost. The coins still cold in her hand, Naomi tightened her grip on the sack. Outside, snow flurried against the mountains. The wagon would come at dawn. You don't have to hold the hammer to build something that stands. The wagon rolled slow along the frozen wash, creaking under the weight of timbers and time. Naomi Yazzie sat stiff-backed beside the driver, the canvas sack of Luke's tools resting like a child across her lap. She hadn't loosened her grip since they left Chinley. The desert still slept beneath a thin crust of frost. Even the sun rising behind the red cliffs didn't warm the air much. The silence between her and the driver was companionable. He was a Navajo man named Tomasz, old enough to have stopped needing to fill the quiet with words. She was grateful for that. The path narrowed through a thicket of juniper, and then they emerged onto Redmond Ranch. It spread like a working man's dream corrals to the east bunkhouse near the main trail, smoke curling from the chimney of a modest ranch house built from thick adobe and pine beams. Behind it all, in a cleared expanse of red earth, stood the bones of a structure, a stone foundation lumber stacked in neat rows under tarps and a rising frame of skeletal beams. The future barn. Naomi's stomach twisted. She had no business here. The wagon pulled to a stop. Tomas climbed down and offered her a hand she didn't take. She slid off the seat on her own boots, crunching on cold dirt, her breath a pale cloud. Before she could adjust the weight of the tool sack on her shoulder, the front door of the ranch house opened, and Clint Redmond stepped out, coat already dusted with trail grit, his hat low over his brow. "Mornin', Mrs. Yazzie." He approached with that same steady calm she remembered from the trading post. "Hope the ride wasn't too hard on you." "No, sir." Her voice came quieter than she wanted. Clint gestured toward the rising structure. "Let me show you where we are." She followed him across the yard. The scent of sawdust, cold earth, and last night's fire lingered. The framework of the barn rose higher up, close, dozens of timbers waiting to be joined, corrected, confirmed. There was weight in that half-built thing. Not just in the wood, but in what it expected of her. 3 men stood near a wagon loaded with supplies. One was a wiry, weathered Diné man with silver streaking his braid and eyes like cooled ash. He leaned against the wheel with arms crossed, expression unreadable. "This here's Benito Chavez," Clint said. "Used to work with Luke back when your husband first started taking jobs outside the nation." Benito gave her a small nod. He knew his wood. Every piece spoke to him. Naomi swallowed hard. He spoke back. Clint turned to the others. "That's Miguel, you'll see he's eager. And this is Jared Ortega. He handles the crew." Jared was tall, maybe mid-30s, with thick arms and a jaw like a chisel. He looked her up and down, polite enough to nod but not friendly enough to smile. "Ma'am," Jared said. "Didn't expect we'd be taking orders from a widow." Naomi flinched inwardly. "She's not here to give orders," Clint said before she could speak. "She's here to keep the build honest." That clear, Miguel nodded quickly. Jared didn't. Naomi set the canvas sack down carefully and drew a slow breath. The wind picked up and tugged at the loose corners of tarp nearby. The desert always had a way of reminding you that it didn't owe you comfort. "I'd like to see what's been done so far," she said. Jared shrugged and gestured toward the frame. "Foundations laid, posts are set. Started working on floor joists yesterday." Naomi followed the line of beams. The stonework looked solid tight, packing no shifting. But something about the spacing along the joist line pulled at her memory like a loose thread. She walked closer, crouched low beside the nearest beam, and ran her hand along the timber's face. The spacing felt off. "How far apart did you set these?" she asked. 18 inches, center to center," Jared said, arms crossed. "Too wide." Jared straightened. "Ma'am, with respect, 16 inches. That's what Luke always said." She didn't raise her voice, but it didn't shake either. "If you're putting livestock in here or wagons with hay, 18 will sag by spring." Benito cleared his throat softly. "She's right. I remember Luke saying the same." Jared's jaw twitched. "Sure, but Luke was the one cutting the joints." "No offense, Mrs. Yazzie, but I ain't him," she interrupted. "But I listened to him every night as he planned. I handed him tools while he explained pitch and weight and bracing. I watched the way he judged timber like it had secrets to tell. So no, I'm not him. But I remember everything he taught me." Jared held her gaze but said nothing more. Clint stepped forward, voice even. "Fix the spacing." Miguel looked impressed. Benito just smiled, faint and knowing. Naomi backed away from the foundation, heart pounding harder than the hoofbeats that had brought her here. Her cheeks burned with something sharp, not pride, not fear, something in between. Jared hadn't believed her. Maybe he still didn't. But Clint hadn't argued. That was something. The rest of the day blurred brief introductions to tools and layout plans, checking the lumber under tarp remeasuring posts, sketching joint patterns in the dirt for Miguel, who hovered nearby like a hungry student. When the sun began its slow descent, painting the buttes in molten orange, Naomi stood with Clint near the tool sack again. "You did good," he said, quiet and low. She shook her head. "I corrected one mistake. Doesn't mean I belong here." He considered that, then gestured toward the rising skeleton of timber behind them. "That barn don't care who you are long as it's built right." She didn't reply. Clint gave a single nod and turned back toward the house, leaving her with the tools and the mountain wind. Naomi looked down at the level nestled in the sack, her fingers brushing over the initials carved deep into cherry wood. The glass vial held the bubble steady even as the wind whispered doubt across the frozen earth. Tomorrow they would begin framing in earnest, and the men would watch her. But for tonight she had earned one decision that stood straight. In the distance, Miguel called her name, holding something up in the fading light. "Miss Naomi," he said, "can you show me how to mark the joint again?" She didn't answer right away. Then slowly she turned to walk toward him. A mistake in inches becomes a collapse in time. The wind scraped over the canyon ridge like a warning as Naomi knelt beside the floor joists just after dawn, her breath puffing in front of her like smoke. Frost had crept in overnight, turning every surface brittle and sharp. She pressed her bare hand to the timber, feeling the cold bite into her palm, but she needed to feel the wood, needed to know it. She had already walked the frame twice that morning. The lines looked clean enough, the joints roughly pegged, but the joist spacing still whispered wrongness. Yesterday they'd fixed the outer ones, but Jared had insisted they didn't need to redo the full length. He hadn't said it aloud, but the message was clear. The widow had made her point. That should be enough. It wasn't. Miguel trudged up from the bunkhouse with his hands jammed in his pockets, face pink from the cold. "Mornin', Miss Naomi." She gave a small nod, still focused on the timber. "You ever seen a barn floor sag, Miguel?" He squinted, thoughtful. "Not sag exactly, but I've seen one bounce like a drum when folks walked over it. Made you nervous standing on it." "Not nervous. Unsafe." She stood and dusted the frost from her knees. "We fixed the rest." Miguel didn't hesitate. "Where do you want me?" She looked at him, then really looked. He wasn't just watching. He was listening. That mattered. They worked in silence for the better part of an hour. Naomi showed him how to measure center to center properly, how to mark and verify twice before cutting. Jared passed them once, his eyes unreadable, and kept walking. At mid-morning, Jared finally came over, wiping sawdust from his gloves. "You going to redo the whole run?" "Yes," Naomi said, without looking up. "We already fixed the end rows." "That's not enough." He let out a breath through his nose. "You like making work harder than it needs to be. I like making sure it holds." She stood straight, meeting his eyes. "You put your name on something, you make sure it doesn't collapse. One wrong measurement now becomes someone's broken leg later." Miguel kept his head down, but Naomi saw the way his hands slowed at the joints, waiting for Jared's reply. Jared glanced toward the ranch house where Clint stood on the porch, arms folded, watching. "Fine," he muttered. "Your call." Naomi didn't let her relief show. She simply nodded and turned back to the work. By midday, her fingers ached from holding the chalk line taut, from checking angles, from scraping old marks and redrawing new ones. Miguel worked close at her side, eager and fast, sometimes too fast. "Slow down," she told him once. "Speed don't matter if it's wrong." He grinned sheepishly. "Luke used to say that too, huh?" She stared at him. "Exactly that." After a pause, Miguel asked, "Did he teach you carpentry, not on purpose?" She set the square down carefully, but he talked when he worked. Always explained what he was doing. I listened. Even when I thought I wouldn't need to. "He ever let you help?" Naomi smiled faintly. "Only once. I ruined a dovetail. He didn't say a word, just handed me another board and made me try again." Miguel looked thoughtful. "I think I'd like him. You'd have learned from him, no doubt." Miguel hesitated, then asked, "You think I could be good at this someday?" Naomi didn't answer immediately. She picked up the marking gauge and handed it to him. "Only one way to find out. Mark the next joint. Clean. Centered. Show me what you've learned." He knelt beside the beam and began his work with quiet determination. Across the site, Benito watched them from under the brim of his hat. The old man hadn't spoken much since her arrival, but Naomi felt his gaze, often measuring, maybe remembering. Later, As she stood reviewing the alignment of the joists, Benito approached, with the slow confidence of a man who knew his pace didn't need apology. "You see true," he said softly. Naomi kept her eyes on the frame. "Only because he taught me how." He studied her face. "I knew Luke. He didn't just teach anyone. He chose who he passed things to." She wasn't sure what to say to that, so she said nothing. Benito reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small carving knife, its handle worn smooth from years of use. "He gave me this. Long time ago. Said it was for someone who shaped more than wood." Naomi blinked against the sudden sting in her eyes. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you're shaping more than this barn." He nodded toward Miguel, who was still bent over his measurements. "He listens to you." She felt her throat tighten. "I don't know what I'm doing, Benito." He smiled with deep lines in his cheeks. Neither did Luke. "Not at first. You learn by doing. Same as anyone." The afternoon shadows stretched longer. The crew packed up tools. Naomi walked the length of the frame one more time, running her hand along the joists they had corrected. Each line precise, each space true. The barn was taking shape not just in structure, but in spirit. She returned the tools to the sack, careful as always. When she picked up the level, she paused. The cherry wood glowed faintly in the slanting light. She set it gently on the frame and watched the bubble settle, centered, still honest. As she reached for it, Miguel stepped beside her. "You think it's straight now?" She handed him the level. "You tell me." He placed it on the beam and watched the bubble rest. His grin said everything. They walked back to the bunkhouse in silence. Naomi felt the weight of the day in her shoulders, but also something else. Not pride. Not yet. But maybe the first breath of belonging. That night, as she sat alone in the small room Clint had offered her, Naomi unwrapped a bundle of cloth from the tool sack and found Luke's old marking gauge, its wood dark with age, the tiny notches along the edge still sharp. Her hand closed around it. For a moment the room felt warmer. Outside, wind kicked up across the desert again, and in the dark, a voice she carried with her whispered clear, "If you see the weakness, fix it. If you feel the shift, brace it. Never leave a thing that might break later." She would remember that. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new places to apply what she knew and what she was still learning, and Miguel, she was certain, would ask for another lesson. To teach is to believe the knowledge will outlive you. The morning came heavy with fog clinging low to the ground, like a veil pulled over the land. Naomi stood near the stacked lumber, her coat pulled tight, and her breath ghosting in front of her. The barn skeleton behind her looked ghostly in the gray light, its sharp line softened by mist, like it wasn't quite real yet. She stared at the rising frame, listening to the hush before work began, thinking of how much still waited to be done and how little room there was for error. Miguel's boots crunched over the frosted earth. He carried 2 planks across his shoulder and a question behind his eyes. "Miss Naomi," he called gently, setting the boards down with care. "Can you show me that mortise joint again, the one for the cross brace?" Naomi turned to him. He stood with shoulders back, but something in his face held hesitation, like he wasn't sure if he had the right to ask. "You practicing on your own?" she asked. He nodded. "Tried last night. Cut one, but it was crooked." Naomi smiled faintly. "That's how I did my first 5. Miguel looked surprised. "You messed up too, worse than you'll ever know." She picked up a stick and knelt down in the dirt, clearing a patch of ground. "Let me show you again." She sketched the joint, slowly marking where the tenon would fit, where the stress would sit, how the grain must be respected. Miguel crouched beside her, watching her hand move. His eyes didn't drift. He was listening not just to the words, but to the meaning between them. "You always go with the grain?" he asked. "Always," she said. "The wood has a way it wants to move. You fight it, it'll split. You work with it, it'll hold for years." He looked up at her. "Is that what Luke taught you?" She hesitated, then nodded. "He used to say you can't force a thing to be stronger than it's meant to be. You have to build with its nature, not against it." Miguel nodded like he was filing the words into his bones. They moved to the sawhorses, and Naomi laid out 2 spare beams. Miguel picked up the marking gauge. She guided his hand, steady, slow, precise. "Don't rush the line. The line tells the blade where to go. Bad line, bad cut." He adjusted, nodded, then drew it again. Better. They worked for over an hour, Naomi correcting his grip, showing how to chisel the corners clean, how to use the mallet like an extension of thought. Jared passed by once, but didn't interrupt. Benito watched from near the posts, silent but attentive. When Miguel finally slid the tenon into the mortise he'd cut, the fit was tight. Not perfect, but true. Naomi nodded, her heart warming in her chest. "That's the first one that would hold weight." Miguel grinned like a boy catching his first fish. "Do another," she said. "Tomorrow you'll teach someone else." He blinked. "Me, you're learning it now. That means you'll remember how hard it was. That makes you a good teacher." They packed up the practice pieces and set them aside. Work on the barn resumed in earnest. Jared called out measurements. Benito directed the timber stacking, and Naomi moved between them, checking cuts, reminding them of alignment, showing Miguel again where his joints needed improvement. The fog lifted slowly. By midday, the sun broke through, warming the adobe of the ranch house and turning the beams golden. Naomi paused to stretch her back and saw Ella standing near the porch steps, arms folded across her chest. Their eyes met. Ella made her way down toward her boots, kicking up small puffs of dust, now that the ground had thawed. "You teaching now?" she asked, nodding toward Miguel. Naomi didn't answer immediately. She wiped her hands on her apron. He asked. I answered. Ella looked toward the barn. "He's working cleaner than he did a few days ago. Because he wants to learn. That's all it takes sometimes." Ella's eyes narrowed slightly. "Luke teach you that too?" Naomi held her gaze. "Luke taught me wood. I learned people on my own." Ella tilted her head as if considering that. "You ever think about what comes after this barn?" Naomi felt a flicker of something, uncertainty or hope she couldn't tell. "Not really, one beam at a time. That's all I've got room for." Ella nodded. "Fair enough." She paused. "Jared's stubborn, but he's watching. That means something." Naomi said nothing. The weight of responsibility pressed deep into her spine. Ella turned to go, but stopped. "When you talk about Luke, it's like he's still around." Naomi didn't blink. "In some ways, he is." Ella gave a small, thoughtful nod and walked back toward the house. That afternoon, Naomi worked beside Jared for the first time without tension. He didn't speak much, but when she pointed out a slightly bowed beam, he corrected it without comment. As the sun slipped low, casting long shadows from the frame, Miguel approached her with a scrap of paper he'd sketched on his own drawing of a joint he wanted to try. Naomi looked it over, then handed it back. "Try it tomorrow," she said. "Show me how you'd cut it." Miguel smiled, his pride quiet but burning strong. The crew packed up. Tools were oiled, covered, tucked into boxes. Naomi carried the cherrywood level in her hand as she made her final walk through the day's work. She placed it on the horizontal beam that spanned the west end of the frame. The bubble settled dead center. She closed her eyes. Luke's voice whispered in the back of her mind, calm, steady, loving. It's not just what you build, Nolly. It's who learns from it after you're gone. The wind picked up, rustling the tarp over the stacked lumber. Inside her chest, something deep shifted, a quiet realization. She wasn't building this barn alone, and she wasn't just keeping his knowledge alive. She was passing it forward. As she walked back toward the bunkhouse, Miguel trailed a few steps behind her, cradling the sketch in both hands like it was something sacred. A roof can stand proud or bow under pressure. So can people. Snow clouds stacked low on the horizon, heavy and dark like bruises threatening to spill over the red cliffs by nightfall. Naomi stood beneath the unfinished rafters, the chill already pressing through her coat. The scent of dry pine and cold earth clung to the air as she walked the perimeter, scanning the alignment of posts and timbers, with Luke's cherrywood level cradled in her hand. She had been dreading this day. The roof pitch decision had to be made. Clint stood at the edge of the build site, arms folded, watching the crew gather near the tool cart. Jared Ortega stepped forward with a folded paper in hand, his own sketch of the roof frame. Miguel hovered nearby, half listening and half glancing toward Naomi. "We've got our joists in place," Jared said, unfolding the drawing on the sawhorse. "Ready to start cutting rafters. I'm proposing we go with an 18-degree pitch. Standard good drainage saves on lumber." Naomi stepped closer, eyeing the drawing. His math was neat, precise, but her stomach turned. "In Montana," she said, voice calm. In January, Jared shrugged. "I've built 12 barns this way, never lost a one." Naomi didn't answer right away. She looked toward the mountains, where snow already dusted the upper ridges. Her fingers tightened around the level. "This isn't just about drainage. It's about load. You get 3 feet of wet snow on a shallow pitch, and your center beam starts to sag. It only takes one storm." Jared gave a small shake of his head. "And steeper means more lumber, more days, more labor. We're not building a church, it's a barn." Clint said nothing, his gaze shifting between them. Naomi took a step toward the drawing. 22.5 degrees. That's what Luke used when he built our Hogan. "I remember the calculation. He even overbuilt it, said the weight of silence would settle heavier than weather." She looked Jared in the eye. "It's not just a number, it's protection." Jared crossed his arms. "Luke isn't here." The words hit hard. She felt them land deep in the center of her chest. Still, she kept her voice level. "No, he's not. But his work is, and so is mine." Miguel shifted uncomfortably. Even Benito looked down. "We're already tight on time," Jared continued. "You steepen the angle, you add cost. You sure about that?" Naomi didn't blink, "I'm sure." Silence hung for a beat too long. Clint exhaled. "All right. We'll hold off for the rest of the day. Revisit after lunch." Jared didn't speak. He gathered his sketch, rolled it tight, and walked off toward the lumber stack. Miguel glanced at Naomi. "You really think it'll make that big a difference?" She turned the level in her hand. "Sometimes an inch is all that keeps something from breaking." The afternoon dragged. The snow clouds edged closer. The crew worked on bracing and non-roof elements, while Naomi moved through the frame, reviewing joint placements and timber integrity. Her hands moved with muscle memory, but her thoughts swirled in uneasy circles. What if she was wrong? What if Luke had been overly cautious? What if Jared was right, and she was just clinging to a ghost? In the quiet of her work, doubt crept in like cold under a doorframe. She found herself beside the practice station, where Miguel had been cutting joints the past few days. He stood over a tenon he was shaping and looked up when she approached. "Ma'am," he said softly. "You okay?" Naomi forced a smile. "Just thinking too much." He hesitated. Can I ask something? Of course. How do you know when to push something like, when to speak up and say it's wrong? Naomi stared at the snow clouds building in the sky. When the cost of being quiet is higher than the risk of being wrong, she said. That's when. He nodded like he understood, and she hoped he did, because she wasn't entirely sure she did herself. As the light began to dim, Clint approached her near the frame. You standing by it? He asked, no accusation in his voice. Just curiosity. I am. He looked toward the mountains where the first flakes had begun to fall like dust from a shaken cloth. I've got your back, he said simply, then walked away. Naomi stood alone, snow catching in her hair, her boots sinking slightly into the softening ground. She looked up at the skeleton of the barn, the joists, the rafters waiting to be cut, the unmade decision hanging over them all. A barn could fall for 100 reasons. She wasn't going to let this be one of them. That night she lay awake in the small bunkhouse room Clint had given her. The wind howled outside. The storm had arrived faster than expected, swirling and snapping against the windows like it was trying to find a way in. She got up, lit the lamp, and sat at the table with Luke's old notebook. She flipped through his diagrams, calculations, notations about timber load tension, snow weight per square foot. His handwriting was steady, confident. A man who knew things because he'd built them again and again. And then she saw it underlined twice. In high elevation, never less than 20 second pitch. Snow tells no lies. She closed the notebook, holding it against her chest like a heartbeat. The snow fell heavy through the night. In the morning, news reached the ranch before breakfast. Miguel ran from the trail, his face white under the dirt. The Henderson barn, he gasped, collapsed overnight. Roof caved in, total loss. Naomi's heart stopped. Jared stood in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon. Clint stepped out of the house, his expression unreadable. Naomi gripped the cherry wood level at her side. What pitch did they use? She asked, voice low. Miguel looked down. 18. Jared didn't say a word. Didn't have to. Naomi turned toward the barn frame, still standing tall in the cold morning light, its roof still to be cut. Still undecided. And for the first time in weeks, she felt no doubt. The sound of another barn falling made her knees buckle because it wasn't hers. The cold that morning was sharp enough to draw blood. The air had the flat, breathless hush that followed a storm, the kind of silence that came after something had broken. Naomi stood at the edge of the Redmond Ranch worksite, boots sunk in crusted snow, watching the crew gather in a slow, stunned silence. Word had spread like wildfire through town. Henderson's new barn, built just before winter, had collapsed overnight. Roof gone. Frame twisted. 6 months of work folded under snow like paper, and Jared Ortega had helped build it. She could feel him behind her, standing just far enough away to pretend he hadn't heard the report from Miguel. But she knew he had. His silence was louder than any confession. The sky was the same dull pewter as the day before, but something in the air had shifted. Naomi wrapped her arms around herself, the cherry wood level resting under one elbow like a lifeline. Her hands were still stiff from sleep, or maybe from fear. She hadn't known how much she'd braced for failure until she heard that it wasn't hers. Clint walked up beside her, his hat pulled low, and his collar turned up against the wind. He didn't speak right away, just looked at the barn frame, their barn still standing untouched by the storm. Still think 22 degrees was excessive? Naomi asked softly, her eyes never leaving the timber skeleton. No, Clint said. I think it saved us. Behind them, Jared approached his footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through snow with the weight of something unspoken. He stopped in front of them, eyes on Naomi. "You were right," he said. She didn't move. Jared swallowed. "That barn. I helped raise it last summer. Same pitch I argued for here." "No one got hurt?" she asked. "No," he said, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "But they lost everything." Naomi let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The wind tugged at the edge of her scarf. "I've built barns at that pitch my whole life," Jared said, quieter now. "But I've never seen snow that heavy that fast." "It only takes once," she replied. "Luke always said the storm doesn't care how long you've been lucky." Jared nodded slowly, his face hard to read. Not proud, not ashamed, just reckoning. "I'll follow your lead from here on," he said. "Whatever you say, we do it your way." Naomi didn't answer right away. She looked back toward the frame. The timbers stood straight. True, but the weight of being right settled on her like fresh snow, silent, cold, and unexpectedly heavy. "It's not about being right," she said. "It's about being responsible. These decisions matter." Jared's gaze dropped. Understood. He turned and walked back toward the worksite, calling out to Miguel to begin unloading the new lumber. Clint watched him go, then turned back to Naomi. "You saved this project." "I trusted what Luke taught me," she said. "No," Clint replied. "You trusted yourself?" Naomi glanced at him, unsure how to respond. Her fingers brushed against the side of the level. Her name wasn't carved into it, but she was the one holding it now. As the day wore on, the crew moved with quiet urgency. No one questioned her instructions, not even Jared. Every angle, every brace, every nail felt heavier than before, measured not just against blueprints, but against the ghost of what might have happened. Benito worked silently beside her, and when he handed her a handsaw without her asking, she paused. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I feel off balance." He nodded. Truth has a way of doing that. She smiled faintly. "I thought I'd feel stronger, vindicated. And instead, I feel tired." Benito chuckled softly. "Because now you know what it means to carry a thing all the way through. It's not just about knowing you have to own what comes with it." That evening, Naomi lingered after the others had gone. The sky was clear now, the clouds pushed out over the eastern ridge and the stars blinked cold and bright overhead. She stood beneath the frame of the barn alone, her breath rising like smoke. The timbers creaked in the wind, solid and living. She ran her hand along the north beam fingertips, brushing each notch and grain like a prayer. A part of her had expected to fail, maybe even needed to, so she wouldn't have to carry the burden of success. But the barn was still standing. Her judgment had held. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the level. She set it on the beam and watched the bubble settle in the center. True. Still true. And still, a quiet voice inside whispered, "What about the next decision? And the one after that?" Back in her bunkhouse room, she sat down at the small wooden table with Luke's notebook open in front of her. The last few pages were filled with calculations, half-finished sketches, fragments of thoughts. His handwriting felt like a voice speaking across time. She stared at it for a long while, then picked up her pencil. Below one of his old notes, she began a new one. January 12th, roof pitch confirmed. Trust was correct. Snow proved it. She paused. Crew followed. Structure held. Her hand slowed. Then she added, "I'm not building what Luke would have built. I'm building what he taught me to see." A knock came at the door. Miguel poked his head in cheeks, red from wind. "Ma'am," he said. "I just wanted to say, thanks. for sticking to what you knew. I'd be working at Henderson's barn right now if you hadn't. Naomi's throat tightened. You were right to speak up, he added. She nodded. Thank you, Miguel. He gave a small smile and closed the door behind him. Naomi leaned back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the winter quiet. The storm had passed, but more storms would come, that was certain. The question wasn't whether she'd make every decision perfectly. It was whether she could keep carrying the weight of the ones that mattered and still show up to make the next one. She placed the level on the table beside the notebook. Luke's initials caught the lamplight. She pressed her hand against them, then let it rest there. Not to hold on, just to remember where she began. Tomorrow, she'd begin again. She hadn't expected the rancher's gaze to carry warmth or the invitation she heard in it. Naomi knelt by the feed barn's side wall, her fingers numb through her gloves as she tightened the bolt on the final support beam. Morning frost clung to the boards, glittering in the rising light. The sound of hammers rang out in the distance, and the scent of fresh hay and pine sawdust filled the cold air. Clint's crew moved with purpose now, no more questions, no more sideways glances. Ever since the Henderson barn collapse, there had been an unspoken shift. They followed her lead, and not just because of Luke's name anymore. But even with that progress, something lingered inside Naomi like a splinter she couldn't reach. A kind of ache not from the labor but from the hollow that grew deeper each time she returned to the bunkhouse alone. She tightened the last bolt and exhaled, watching her breath cloud up. The barn stood solid now, the frame holding strong. It was almost done. Almost. Clint approached from behind boots, crunching over frost-hardened ground. His shadow stretched long in the morning light. He stopped just beside her, his stance easy but alert, like a man always listening for what wasn't being said. You didn't eat again, he said, not as a question. Naomi rose, brushing her gloves off on her coat. Didn't notice. He nodded slowly. You've been pushing hard. Isn't that what this job requires? Clint looked at her, then really looked. His eyes weren't cold like she expected. They weren't calculating or dismissive. They were steady, watching. A touch of concern etched in their depth. You've already proved yourself, he said. This ranch wouldn't have held up without your designs, hell without your nerve. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. She wasn't used to praise that didn't come with a condition. She didn't quite know where to set it inside her. I'm not trying to prove anything, she said quietly. You're trying not to break, Clint said. That caught her off guard. Naomi looked down at her hands. Her gloves were fraying at the fingertips, threadbare from weeks of gripping timber and steel. Her palms ached. Her heart more so. Luke's gone, she said. The tools don't carry his hands anymore. The house is empty. I don't have a plan after this job ends. Clint didn't move. His silence wasn't empty. It made space. When he died, Naomi continued, voice rough, everything stopped. But the world kept going like it didn't even notice. People passed me in the street. They smiled. They said time heals. But time doesn't heal. It just leaves you behind if you don't get moving. Clint's voice came quiet but firm. You didn't get left behind. You carried what you had left. Naomi turned to him, but to where he hesitated, then said, Maybe you don't have to carry it alone. She blinked, startled by the weight of that simple sentence. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of cedar wood from the tree line, and Naomi's eyes searched Clint's. She hadn't expected his gaze to carry warmth or the invitation she heard in it. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't obligation. It was presence. A steady offer of standing beside her, no strings, no judgment. You mean as a friend? She asked. Clint gave a small, wry smile. I mean as someone who sees you. Naomi felt a strange heat behind her eyes, and she turned away, focusing on the barn again. But the boards blurred slightly, her breath hitching before she forced it calm. You ever feel guilty for wanting something after loss? She asked. All the time, Clint said. Especially when what I want might save me. Naomi's voice dropped. And if it doesn't, then I'm still better for wanting it. The words sank in deeper than she expected. She didn't know what to do with them, how to hold them. So instead, she nodded barely. I'm not ready, she said. I didn't ask you to be, Clint replied. I'm just here. They stood together in the morning light, not speaking. The wind moved through the bare branches behind the barn, whispering things Naomi couldn't quite make out, but somehow felt. Later that day, as the crew packed up, Naomi found herself wandering toward the edge of the property where the fence met the old creek bed. Clint had said something about an old bridge needing inspection. Her boots followed the winding trail, passing through pine shadows and rust-colored leaves still clinging to bare limbs. She found the bridge half-rotted boards, soft in the center, one support cracked through. It had been used for cattle drives decades ago, she guessed. Now it stood as a quiet monument to things forgotten. But the view beyond it stopped her short. A clearing stretched out wide and gentle on the other side of the creek, sunlight pooling over dry grass, and a single old oak rooted at its center. It wasn't just peaceful, it felt like a place meant for something new. Footsteps behind her broke the silence. Clint appeared, hands in his coat pockets, eyes flicking to the bridge, then to the field. Used to be where the summer bonfire went, he said. My father built that bridge. Said it would last longer than him. He was wrong. Naomi smiled faintly, still holding on. Barely, he said, then paused. Like some of us. She looked at him. He wasn't hinting. He was revealing. I don't know what I'm doing after this barn, she said again, more honest this time. The town feels different. I don't fit like I used to. I don't know if I'm supposed to leave or stay. You don't have to decide yet, Clint said, but you ought to know if you stay, there's work here. And not just hammer and nail work. She turned toward him, waiting. He continued. The ranch could use a new overseer, someone who sees structure and people the way you do. Miguel trusts you. Benito already acts like your boss. And me, I'd sleep better knowing the place was in your hands. Naomi didn't answer right away. The creek trickled softly below them, and the breeze tugged her scarf loose from her collar. She took in the field again, the open sky, the quiet strength of the place. I thought I came here to finish something, she said. But maybe I was being brought to begin. Clint didn't press, just waited. She met his eyes again. Let me think on it. He nodded. Of course. They turned back toward the barn together, their footsteps soft against the dirt trail. As they reached the ridge, Naomi paused, glancing back at the bridge, the clearing, the oak. It felt like the first breath of spring breaking through the frost. And somewhere deep inside, something opened, a slow, cautious warmth unfurling like light across a cold field. He hadn't just hired her. He'd trusted her with the bones of the land. Naomi stood at the edge of the newly finished barn, her hands on her hips, boots planted in the damp soil. The structure loomed behind her, strong, clean-lined and true. The final coat of varnish on the doors gleamed in the afternoon light. It wasn't just a barn anymore. It was a monument to everything she had fought through, to survival, to reclaiming something that had nearly slipped from her grasp. Miguel handed her a clipboard with the last of the inspection details. You did it, he said, glancing up at the wide rafters and new beams. Looks like it'll stand for another 100 years. Naomi smiled, though it came slow. We did it. Benito came trotting up behind them, straw clinging to his flannel shirt and his cheeks flushed from work. Clint said he wants to meet with you by the south paddock, he said, panting a little. Said it's important. Naomi raised a brow. Now, right now, Benito said, grinning. Told me to run. She handed Miguel the clipboard and peeled off her gloves, the calluses on her fingers, a quiet testament to the last few months. As she headed down the sloped path toward the south field, she felt the weight of possibility pressing on her shoulders, only it didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. When she reached the paddock, Clint was waiting near the old cedar post, where the fencing line began. His sleeves were rolled up, and his hat hung on the saddle horn of his gelding Dusty, who was grazing nearby. There was a breeze in the air, soft but steady, and the grass danced in waves across the wide field. You wanted to see me, Naomi asked, brushing a lock of hair from her eyes. Clint didn't turn right away. He was staring across the land, eyes narrowed in thought. Finally, he spoke. I've been thinking a lot about legacy. Naomi folded her arms. Big topic for the middle of a Thursday. He smirked. Yeah, well, ranch life doesn't leave much time for philosophy. But it hit me this morning my father never got to build what he really wanted. He kept this land alive, kept the cattle going, but his dreams, they were always buried under bills and drought. Naomi watched him closely. His voice had softened just a shade. Not broken, but careful. And what about you? She asked. Clint finally turned to her. I thought I'd just keep the place running. Get through one season at a time. But then you showed up with a busted truck, a broken heart, and a mind that could see what this land could be. Naomi's throat tightened. I only came to sell what was left of Luke's tools. Yeah, he said, his voice low, but that wasn't all you had. She looked down the earth beneath her boots, grounding her. Clint continued, I want to offer you the job permanently. Ranch manager, full title, full salary, control over building projects, labor scheduling, and long-term planning. I'd still own it, but I want you running it. Naomi blinked. That's not a small offer. No, it's not, Clint said. But you've earned more than just a paycheck. You gave this place direction again. You gave me direction. She hesitated, searching for the right words. You sure about this? He nodded once. He hadn't just hired her. He'd trusted her with the bones of the land. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them slowly, the wind pulling gently at her jacket. Then I'll accept. But I want a few things. Clint raised an eyebrow. Already negotiating. She smiled faintly. First, Miguel becomes foreman. He's earned it. And Benito gets more time in the books. You can see that boy's got ideas, and he's hungry to learn. Clint nodded. Done. Second, we build a new bunkhouse come spring. The crew's packed in like sardines. Fair. And third, Naomi hesitated. I want the north pasture cleared. There's good space near the creek for a second barn, something that can handle breeding programs, or maybe a small vet station. Long-term investment. Clint chuckled. You've already mapped out the future, haven't you? She tilted her head. I never stopped drawing. They stood quietly for a while, watching Dusty lazily swat his tail as he grazed. You're not the same woman who showed up with those tools, Clint said. But I think she'd be proud of who you've become. Naomi looked away, blinking hard. The weight of those words settled deep in her chest, because they were true. She hadn't realized how far she'd come until someone said it aloud. Thank you, she whispered. As they turned to walk back side by side, something subtle shifted between them. The unspoken bond that had grown over shared work, long silences, and harder truths seemed to wrap around them, like the late autumn air, brisk but promising. Later that night, The crew gathered around the fire pit behind the bunkhouse. It was the end of project celebration, and someone had brought moonshine. Benito strummed a guitar, singing off-key, while Miguel roasted strips of venison over the flames. Laughter bubbled up easily, as if the cold couldn't touch them when they were all together. Naomi sat beside Clint on a wooden bench, a mug of coffee in her hands. She glanced around the firelight and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. "You ever think we could do more than just survive?" she asked him. Clint looked at her. "With you here, I think we already are." The moon rose higher, casting silver light across the ranch, and Naomi closed her eyes, letting it all soak in the warmth of the fire. The distant sounds of horses shifting in their stalls, the soft hum of people rebuilding something real. She had come to the ranch with nothing but a box of tools and a name that no longer carried weight. Now she had something more than memory. She had a future. And in that moment, wrapped in stars and smoke and quiet joy, she realized it wasn't just about the land or the barn or even the job. It was about the roots she'd begun to grow in a place that finally made space for her. And tomorrow she'd wake up not as the widow trying to survive, but as the woman building something that could outlast her. "Naomi, this isn't just a storm. It's everything we've worked for being tested." The air had turned mean before dawn. Naomi stood on the porch of the bunkhouse, her eyes scanning the horizon as clouds rolled in, low, dark, and heavy with fury. The wind snapped at the tarps in the supply yard, whipping dust into tight spirals. Miguel's voice crackled over the two-way radio in her hand, warning of dropping pressure and rising panic. They'd seen storms before, hard ones. But this one, it had teeth. Naomi didn't bother with breakfast. She grabbed her oilskin coat, snapped the buttons up to her throat, and moved fast toward the barn where the new foals were stalled. The scent of unsettled animals hit her before she got there. Inside, the horses paced and neighed, their bodies slick with anxious sweat. She started securing feed bins and bracing stall doors. Benito was already inside, hauling sandbags and muttering prayers under his breath. "Winds are coming from the east," he shouted over the rattling walls. Clint said, "Get everything in lockdown." The creek's already up 2 feet. Naomi didn't hesitate. "I'll head to the west fence line, check the runoff path. If that goes, we'll flood the whole pasture." Benito grabbed her arm. "You shouldn't go alone." "I won't," she said, yanking open the barn doors. "Get Miguel. Meet me by the north rise." She saddled a mare, fast, Honeydew, steady and sure-footed, and galloped toward the edge of the property. Trees leaned unnaturally as wind barreled down from the canyon. Branches flew. Dirt stung her cheeks. Her breath came fast, and the world narrowed to motion and instinct. At the fence line, the runoff ditch was already clogged with debris. Logs brushed dead leaves packed so tight, water surged over, spilling into the grazing field like a slow poison. Naomi dismounted and dropped to her knees, clawing at the blockage with bare hands. Her nails tore mud, caked her sleeves, and water bit into her boots. Still, she didn't stop. Miguel came barreling up with a shovel, Benito behind him with ropes and sandbags. The three of them worked in brutal silence. Thunder cracked above them like a gunshot. The wind howled. "Naomi, this isn't just a storm, it's everything we've worked for being tested." Miguel's voice steadied her as she pressed a boulder from the trench, sending a gush of water pouring back into the ditch. The pressure eased slightly, but not enough. Benito lashed the sandbags to the fence posts, cursing in Spanish as one burst open in his arms. Through it all, Naomi didn't let herself think about what could go wrong. Not the newborn calves in the lower pasture. Not the old bunkhouse with its leaky roof. Not the generator that had sputtered last week and still hadn't been fixed. She thought only of holding the land, holding the trust Clint had given her, holding the fragile tether that kept all of this from unraveling. By the time they returned to the main barn, the storm had shifted to hard rain. Wind still screamed through the rafters, but the first wave had passed. Inside, the crew gathered mud-covered, wild-eyed, soaked to the bone. Clint came through the back door, dripping wet with a busted gate slung over his shoulder and blood running down his temple. Naomi rushed to him. "You're hurt." He waved her off. "It's a scratch. Had to haul a steer out of the ravine." "Clint," I said, "I'm fine." His eyes searched hers, then softened. "You did good. You kept it from washing out." She swallowed hard. "It's not over." "No," he agreed. "But neither are we." Lightning snapped again, but this time it lit up more than fear. It lit up grit, determination, and unity. Later that night, with most of the crisis stabilized, Naomi sat alone in the tack room, peeling off wet socks and rubbing her aching feet. The lantern flickered in the corner, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. She was bone-tired, her muscles like lead, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. There was something bigger moving through her, deeper than fear, more vital than adrenaline. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was bracing for disaster. She felt like she was standing inside it, and standing firm. Clint entered without knocking. He closed the door gently behind him, leaned against it like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "I thought we'd lose it today," he said quietly. "I really did." Naomi looked up. "So did I." He walked to the wall, pulled off his gloves, and studied her in the lamplight. "But we didn't." "No," she said. "We didn't." Clint dropped into the wooden chair beside her, the silence between them no longer awkward, but necessary. "You held it together," he said. "I had help." He reached over and touched her hand, calloused fingers to calloused fingers, mud still clinging at the edges. "You are the spine of this ranch, Naomi." She blinked at him. "And you're the one who let me be." They sat like that for a long time, neither speaking, letting the night carry its weight while their hands remained clasped. Rain pattered on the tin roof. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The storm was dying, but its lesson lingered. The ranch wouldn't fall because it had been built on stronger backs than anyone had realized. And Naomi. She was no longer surviving out of necessity. She was leading by choice. As dawn bled across the sky, painting everything in grays and pinks, Naomi stepped out onto the porch and took a long breath. The fields were soaked, but intact. The fences had held. The animals had weathered the worst. She felt something in her chest, not just relief, but pride. Not just pride, but clarity. There was more coming. Always was. Another storm, another challenge. But she wasn't just ready. She was rooted. "Don't you dare tell me I don't belong here. I bled for this place." Naomi's voice cracked like a whip, sharp and unrelenting against the low rumble of the barn. Her hands were planted firmly on her hips, dirt caked beneath her nails from the morning's work. Across from her stood Mr. Rusk, the banksman, dressed too clean for a place still drying from the storm. His boots had barely touched mud, but he held himself like he owned the land. And in his tone, he made it clear he thought he did. "I'm not here to argue, Ms. Chino. I'm simply the messenger. The bank has concerns. The note's due in 2 months. After the flooding and the repairs, well, the risk is evident. The risk," Naomi's eyes blazed. "The risk is sitting on that porch every night with this land carved into their hands. It's Miguel hauling fence in a thunderstorm. Benito fixing roofs until his fingers go numb. It's Clint standing between a panicked steer and a broken gate. We're not a risk. We're the reason this place is still breathing. Mr. Rusk adjusted his collar, unbothered. Sentiment doesn't pay notes, Ms. Chino. Profit does. Naomi took a step closer, chest rising. Don't you dare tell me I don't belong here. I bled for this place. Clint entered then, quiet and deliberate, his presence enough to make Rusk shift uncomfortably. He crossed the barn floor and stood next to Naomi, saying nothing, just grounding the moment. Mr. Rusk, Clint said after a long pause, if you're done throwing your weight around, we've got work to do. Fences still need mending. The man hesitated, clearly weighing the optics, then tipped his hat with stiff fingers and turned without another word. The silence he left behind roared. Naomi's shoulders dropped as soon as he was gone. Her hands shook, not from fear, but fury. Clint reached over and steadied her wrist, just enough to stop the tremor. He'll be back, she murmured. Let him, Clint said. You said what needed saying. But it wasn't just about what she said. It was about what came next. After Rusk left, a heaviness settled on the ranch. Not a storm, but the quiet weight of uncertainty. Naomi gathered the crew in the feed shed, Benito, Miguel, Martha, and even the two youngest hands, Eli and Kendra. Everyone had heard about the bank visit. You couldn't hide that kind of tension on land this tight-knit. We're not out of the woods, Naomi told them. They think this place is weak because of one storm and a couple dents in the roof. But we're not. Martha said, arms crossed. No, Naomi said, locking eyes with each of them. We're not. They began making plans, tightening expenses, repairing what they could themselves, and leaning into the ranch's side operations. Martha offered to handle more direct sales from the garden plots. Benito talked about training horses for neighbors. Kendra suggested opening the gates for riding lessons on the weekends. Every idea was a thread in the fabric Naomi refused to let unravel. Later that evening, as Naomi and Clint walked the fence line near the back pasture, the sun painted everything gold. A breeze rolled through the fields like a hymn. They'll keep coming, Naomi said quietly. Folks like Rusk, they don't see land. They see ledgers. They don't see you either, Clint added. Not for what you've become here. She looked at him. What have I become? He stopped, reaching out to brush a wisp of hair from her face. A pillar, a fighter, and someone I wouldn't want to do this without. Her heart skipped. She wasn't sure what to say to that, but she didn't need to say anything, not yet. They just stood together, side by side, as shadows lengthened across the land they loved. Inside the house that night, Naomi found a letter tucked beneath the ceramic rooster on the kitchen table. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, with loops and careful spacing. It was from Clint's sister, Joanna. She was offering to visit and help with bookkeeping, said she'd heard things were tough after the storm. She'd worked in accounting at a co-op in Amarillo and could lend her eye to the ranch's finances. Naomi sat down the letter, trembling in her hands. Joanna had never shown much interest in the ranch. She'd left young, chased, different dreams. But now here she was, offering aid when most turned a blind eye. Clint entered the kitchen, drying his hands with a rag. She means it, he said before Naomi could ask. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to. That looks loud. Naomi laughed, a short breath through her nose. I didn't expect her to care. She doesn't show it often, but she watches. She's seen what this place has become. Naomi folded the letter slowly. Then we say yes. He nodded. We'll make room. That night, Naomi lay awake long after the house had gone quiet. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the low hoot of an owl outside the window. Don't you dare tell me I don't belong here. The words echoed in her chest. Because for the first time in years, maybe ever, she didn't have to prove she belonged. She already did. Not just to the land, but to the people. To Clint. to the future they were fighting for with every breath, every calloused hand, every stubborn, defiant heartbeat. In the coming days, she would face numbers and ledgers and bureaucracy with the same fire she used to face storms. She would hold this place the way she had held her own soul through grief and back again. Because this wasn't just a ranch, it was a promise, and she wasn't done keeping it. I didn't come here to be rescued, I came here to rise. Naomi's voice shook only slightly, but it didn't waver. She stood under the barn's open rafters, her boots firm on the worn floorboards, as Joanna scrolled through the final set of numbers. Papers rustled. The wind outside carried the smell of horses and sunburnt hay. The air inside, however, was thick, charged not with fear, but with a quiet anticipation that had grown with every repaired fence, every harvest weighed by Martha's hands, every lesson taught by Kendra under the oaks. Clint leaned against a post behind her arms, crossed, watching Naomi with something deeper than pride, something like awe. Joanna finally looked up from the ledger. Her polished nails tapped once against the last column. "This ranch," she said carefully, "is solvent." The word rang out like thunder. Solvent. Not thriving, not debt-free, but surviving, breathing, holding its own. Naomi closed her eyes just for a moment, letting that word sink past skin bone and bruised memory. It had been a long road since the day she'd stood in this very barn, nearly selling off her late husband's last socket wrench to eat. The road hadn't ended, but it had bent in her favor. "What about the contingency clause?" Clint asked, ever practical. Joanna nodded. "We've bought time, but not forever. You'll need to keep expanding the operations. Diversifying saved you, but it'll take more to stay ahead of the note come fall." Naomi nodded, already thinking 10 steps ahead. They stepped out of the barn into the mid-morning sun. The ranch was alive. Benito and Miguel were clearing brush along the north fence line, while Eli and Kendra led a group of students out to the paddocks. Laughter rang out as one of the kids tried vaulting a fence and landed on his rear. Even the land itself seemed more vibrant green from recent rains and flush with purpose. Clint walked beside Naomi toward the house. "You should be proud." She shrugged, swallowing against the emotion thick in her throat. "I'm relieved. Proud comes later." Joanna caught up to them with her satchel slung across her shoulder. "There's something else you should know." Naomi slowed. "Go on." "I spoke to an old colleague of mine from Amarillo. He's with the co-op now real estate arm. They're interested in spotlighting sustainable ranches with community education components. Could mean funding partnerships, but they'll need proof more than just numbers. They'll want to see your story." "My story?" Naomi asked warily. Joanna nodded. "The whole thing, from loss to now. What you've built here, how you turned it around, it matters. It's not just survival, it's transformation." Clint glanced over his eyes, steady. "You okay with that?" Naomi looked out across the fields. The idea of opening up the darkest chapters of her life to strangers made her skin prickle. But then she thought of the women in town, the ones who had stopped her after Sunday service to ask quietly how she managed. She thought of Martha, whose garden sales kept 3 local families afloat, and of Kendra, who had started working with special needs children on weekends, letting them groom the gentlest horses. Her story wasn't just hers anymore. She drew a deep breath. "I didn't come here to be rescued. I came here to rise." If telling that helps someone else stand, then yeah. Let's do it. That night, Naomi sat by the kitchen window with a notebook and pen. The light of the oil lamp caught the small lines forming at the corners of her eyes. She wrote slowly, deliberately, not censoring the pain or the grit. She wrote about Micah, his laughter, the way he used to leave tools in the wrong drawers and swear about it the next day. The way he looked at her like she was both the storm and the anchor. She wrote about the way the world caved in the day he didn't come home, and how her hands shook for weeks, trying to hold up everything he left behind. She wrote about selling the tools, feeling like she was selling the last parts of him. She wrote about Clint's boots on the porch, and the sound of Martha's stew bubbling on an empty stomach. About the first time Miguel called her Jefa with respect, not pity. About the fire. About the night she yelled at the stars and didn't care if they yelled back. When she finally put the pen down, the window had fogged with her breath, and the ranch outside lay cloaked in moonlight. The following day, Joanna began preparing the pitch for the co-op. Clint started reviewing land usage records with renewed focus. Benito took over logistics for fencing repairs. It was as though everyone had silently agreed there was more at stake now than just keeping the ranch afloat. There was legacy. Late one afternoon, Naomi joined Kendra in the paddock. A young boy named Lucas was brushing down a gelding with uneven strokes, his tongue poking out the side of his mouth in concentration. Naomi crouched beside him. "You know what you're doing?" she asked gently. Lucas grinned, missing one of his front teeth. "Kinda." Naomi laughed. "That's how most of us start." The boy looked up. "Miss Naomi, is this your place?" She paused. "It is. My mom says you're strong, like strong, that you helped people and stuff." Naomi felt her throat tighten. "Well, your mom's kind, but I didn't do it alone." Lucas patted the horse. "My dad left. She says we're going to be okay anyway, because people like you make places like this." She reached out and steadied his hand on the brush. "Then we're both going to keep building places like this. Together." Later that night, as thunder rolled gently across the distance, Naomi and Clint sat on the porch, mugs of coffee warming their hands. "She's right, you know," Clint said. "Who, Joanna? You've done something real here." Naomi leaned into the chair, letting her shoulders drop. "We've done it. Together." He smiled, his eyes catching hers. "Think we might even keep doing it. Long term." There was something in his voice, unspoken but undeniable. Naomi didn't look away. "I think I'd like that." A gust of wind swept through the cottonwoods, scattering leaves like whispers. And in that quiet, Naomi realized this was no longer just a fight to survive. This was the beginning of something far greater. Maybe the fire was meant to clear the old brush, so we could finally see the new trail ahead. The morning broke slow and golden, brushing the ranch with a softness Naomi hadn't felt in years. The skies over Palo Duro Canyon stretched wide and unburdened, like they'd exhaled with her. The distant low of cattle and the scent of cinnamon bread drifted from the house, mingling with the scent of leather and sun-warmed cedar. Naomi stood on the front porch, her palms curled around a chipped enamel mug, steam curling into the air. Clint was beside her, arms loose at his sides, one hand occasionally brushing hers. They said little, but the quiet was full. It had been 6 weeks since the co-op's approval. 6 weeks since her story had been sent out into the world, not as a cry for help, but a beacon of hope. And the response had been overwhelming: neighbors offering labor businesses, contributing supplies, volunteers asking how to help schools, sending letters of support. The ranch was no longer just land and cattle. It was a sanctuary, a classroom, a second chance. She sipped slowly, her gaze sweeping across the fields. Martha was organizing a produce stand out front, chatting with a young mother Naomi didn't recognize. Benito and Miguel were setting up the new irrigation hoses Clint had bartered for with the hardware store owner. Eli was leading a workshop on saddle care in the barn, with half a dozen eager teens following every move. Kendra was under the awning with a girl in a wheelchair, gently teaching her how to hold a halter without spooking the pony. Naomi had envisioned rebuilding, but she hadn't dared to hope for rebirth. A dust trail appeared down the main road, and Clint nudged her shoulder. That'll be them. The truck pulled up tires, crunching the gravel, and Joanna stepped out, wearing a look that mixed excitement and nerves. Behind her came a man in a tailored denim blazer and sharp cowboy boots, clearly from the co-op board, but trying hard not to look like it. Naomi descended the steps and shook his hand firmly. "Naomi Rios," he said, his tone respectful. "You've got quite a story, ma'am." "I've got a ranch," she corrected gently, "and a community." He smiled. "And that's exactly why we're here." They walked the land, Naomi answering questions, pointing out fencing upgrades, explaining how revenue from cattle breeding would be reinvested into the education wing. The board member took notes, asked sharp questions, and occasionally paused to soak in the laughter, the open fields, the bustle of life springing from once barren corners. Near the end of the tour, they stood near the horse paddock where Clint was working with a stubborn colt. "You know, the man said we get a lot of applications. People trying to do good things. But what you've done here, it's not just a turnaround. It's a blueprint." Naomi nodded slowly. "Blueprints don't work without a crew." He glanced back toward the house. "Well, your crew's one hell of a testament." As they said their goodbyes, Joanna lingered. "You did it." Naomi shook her head. "We're just getting started." That evening, after the guests were gone and the fields settled into the hush of dusk, the ranch family gathered for supper under the live oaks. A long wooden table had been dragged out, covered in mismatched chairs, and dishes brimming with chili roasted corn, fried green tomatoes, and Martha's now famous pecan pie. Clint raised a glass of sweet tea. "To the woman who didn't just save the ranch," he said, "but made it into something none of us knew we needed." Naomi blushed as laughter and cheers followed. "To the people who refused to let me do it alone," she said, raising her glass. "And to the next trail, we'll find it together." As night settled in and fireflies blinked between the branches, Naomi drifted away from the group, her boots crunching softly on the gravel path toward the barn. The door creaked as she stepped inside, the smell of hay and leather wrapping around her like a memory. She paused at the old tool bench. Most of Micah's tools were still there, oiled, repaired, respected. But beside them now were new ones. Not replacements, but additions. Like the ranch itself. Naomi ran a finger across the worn wood. She thought of that first day, dust in her mouth, and her pride aching as she tried to sell what little she had, and of the man who saw her instead of her desperation. She turned when she heard Clint behind her. "You always sneak off during pie time?" he asked. Needed a moment. He stepped in beside her, gaze following hers to the workbench. "You ever think he'd have imagined all this?" She smiled faintly. "He imagined me broken without him. He would have hated that." Clint didn't argue. Naomi sighed deep and full. Maybe the fire was meant to clear the old brush, so we could finally see the new trail ahead. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his hand lingering at her cheek. "You blazed it, Naomi, with your bare hands." She met his gaze, unflinching. "But I won't walk it alone." The kiss came slow, sure, and full of everything unspoken between them since the beginning. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't borrowed from grief. It was built, earned in dirt and sweat and shared silence. When they finally pulled apart, she smiled against his chest. "We should head back," she said. "Martha'll think you kidnapped me." "Worth it," he murmured. As they walked back to the house, hand in hand, the stars blinked awake overhead. Naomi looked out at the ranch, the land she once feared would swallow her whole, now pulsing with life and belonging. The grief had shaped her, but it didn't define her. This land, these people, this work, this was her new inheritance. And this time she wasn't giving it up for anything. The educational lesson learned from this story is that loss does not take away a person's usefulness or wisdom, it often reveals it. Life may strip things down to the bare beams, but what truly matters is the knowledge, character, and perseverance we've built over the years. When we keep showing up, leaning on community, and trusting the skills earned through a lifetime of experience, even hardship can become a foundation for something meaningful. In later seasons of life, purpose is not found in starting over, but in continuing forward with steadiness, courage, and care.